So how about this? The church did not exist during any part of the first 69 weeks or 483 years of the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. We have just observed that the first 69 weeks ended on the day of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The church did not begin historically until the day of Pentecost, evidently in Acts chapter 2. We have more evidence in Acts chapter 3 where Peter says Jesus is not going to bring in his kingdom, basically, not going to come. He's going to postpone that arrival. Acts chapter 3. And that took place, Acts 2 and 3, nearly 2 months after the day of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, wherein he was crucified instead of kingified. You can check this out here on the church when it began. Therefore, the church did not begin historically until nearly 2 months after the end of the first 69 weeks of the 70 weeks prophecy. What happened to the next 7 years? We will find out. We should note that God consistently kept the church out of all the first 69 weeks. Thus it is evident that he intended the first 69 weeks of the 70 weeks prophecy to be his program specifically for Israel. We're not going to have a hybrid age. Previous ages excluded Israel. Then we have Israel. Now we have the church. But not for the church. Program specifically for Israel, not for the church. This was consistent with the concept that Israel and the church are distinct entities. So, in addition, it was consistent with the second significant fact noted earlier concerning the 70 weeks prophecy that God determined all 70 weeks specifically for Israel and Jerusalem, not for the church. Point 5. God temporarily interrupted his 70 weeks program for Israel at the end of the first 69 weeks or 483 years with a gap of time that is now approaching 2,000 years in duration. Made the font size a little bit bigger for my eyes here. God temporarily interrupted his 70 weeks program for Israel at the end of the first 69 weeks or 483 years with a gap of time that is now approaching 2,000 years in duration. Thus, the 70th week, or last 7 years of the 490 years involved in the prophecy, did not follow immediately after the end of the first 69 weeks or 483 years. We read in Scripture, that particular period of time, there were believers there that evidently was a continuation of the period of time for Israel. That one last week. So, the period of time between the 69th and 70th week, about 2,000 years, uncharacteristic of the first 69 weeks. This indicates that the 7-year tribulation period has not yet begun, characterized by the prophecies that we can read and find out. There are several evidences for this gap of time between the end of the first 69 weeks and the beginning of the 70th week. First, Daniel 9:27 teaches that abomination will come with desolation during the 70th week. But Jesus indicated that this abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel will come shortly before his second coming, immediately after the Great Tribulation. Matthew 24:15-21 and verses 29 to 31. Meaning that the 70th week, or last 7 years of the prophecy, must also come shortly before Jesus' second coming. I did a study for a term paper in seminary on Matthew's 24 and 25 chapters, and provided details of this. And check it out to verify the church is not present. Where did it go? 2 Daniel 9 indicates that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans fits within the scope of the 70 weeks or 490 years of the prophecy. Thus, this destruction was to occur before the end of the 70th week, or last period of 7 years. In light of this, and the fact that the first 69 weeks ended with Jesus' triumphal entry, if the last 7 years of the 490 years had followed immediately after the end of the first 69 weeks, Jerusalem and the temple would have been destroyed just 7 years after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem in the early 30s A.D. It is a fact of history, however, that Jerusalem and the temple were not destroyed until 70 A.D., several decades after Jesus' triumphal entry. Only if there were a gap of time between the end of the first 69 weeks and the beginning of the 70th week could this destruction have taken place so late and still be within the scope of the 70 weeks or 490 years prophecy. Third, it is not unusual for biblical prophecies to contain gaps of time. For example, Isaiah 9:6 says, "For unto us a child is born," referring to the Messiah's first coming, "and the government shall be upon his shoulders," related to the Messiah's second coming. Zechariah 9:9-10 states, "Behold, thy king cometh unto thee, lowly and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass," referring to the Messiah's triumphal entry during his first coming. "And his dominion shall be from sea even to sea, and from the river even to the ends of the earth," related to the Messiah's second coming. Point 6. God started the church very shortly after he interrupted his 70 weeks program for Israel and Jerusalem with a gap of time at the end of the first 69 weeks. God started the church very shortly after he interrupted his 70 weeks program for Israel and Jerusalem with a gap of time at the end of the first 69 weeks. God brought the church into existence just 57 days after the first 69 weeks ended with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So there is something peculiar, not ongoing, for the Israel period, the Jewish period. But then all of a sudden, we see the characteristics of that last 7 years, 7-year tribulation period. The church isn't there. There are believers there, but we have temple worship. We don't have temple worship now during the church age period, right? And we don't have the temple rebuild. And we don't have all the grandiose Antichrist stuff. The invasion of the temple and so on. A summary of the facts, Ray, the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9. The examination of the 70 weeks program, the examination of the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9 has produced several significant facts. First, the Daniel 9:24-27 prophecy involves 70 weeks, or 490 years of time. Second, God determined all 70 weeks, or 490 years, specifically for Israel and Jerusalem, not for the church, as we see the characteristics of that. Third, the first 69 weeks, or 483 years, ended with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the foal of a donkey on Palm Sunday. Fourth, the church did not exist during any part of the first 69 weeks, or 483 years. Sixth, God started the church very shortly after he interrupted his 70 weeks program for Israel and Jerusalem with a gap of time at the end of the first 69 weeks. 8. Strong inferences for Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy and the presence of the church on earth. These 6 facts, when taken together and combined with the distinction between Israel and the church noted at the beginning of this chapter, prompted 3 strong inferences. Just take a look at the characteristics of the church versus Israel. And I want to go into that after this study. So you know, characteristics of the church period of time, quite different from the characteristics of the Israel period of time. Although Israel is existing now during the church age, in characteristics of Israel, there's no temple worship. There are no characteristics, there are no historical events that are grandiose and destructive for Israel's time. Okay, we have 8a. 5, 6, 7, 8a. God does not intend the church to be present on the earth for any part of the 70 weeks or 490 years he has determined specifically for Israel and Jerusalem. He intends to keep his 70 weeks program for Israel and Jerusalem and his program for the church separate and distinct from each other, just as Israel and the church are distinct entities. Where's the church? With Israel there. Where's Israel with the church? See? This does not mean that God stopped working altogether with Israel and Jerusalem when he interrupted the 70 weeks program and started the church. Instead, it means that God temporarily stopped one specific program, the 70 weeks program, with Israel and Jerusalem while he works his program with the church in the world. There is a major difference between saying that God stopped working with Israel altogether and saying that he temporarily stopped one specific program with that nation. God worked with Israel and Jerusalem in ways other than the 70 weeks program for many centuries, before going on 20, before he started that specific program after Daniel's time. In like manner, during the present interruption of the 70 weeks program, he works with the nation and city in ways other than that program. God intends the church to be present on the earth specifically during the interrupting gap of time between the end of the first 69 weeks, or 483 years, and the beginning of the 70th week, or last 7 years. If God intended to mix any part of the 70 weeks program for Israel and Jerusalem with his program for the church, why didn't he start the church during the first 69 weeks of the 70 weeks program? Because Israel was a miserable failure all the way through this period of time. That's why Jesus didn't come and bring in the kingdom, because Israel crucified Jesus. Only a few became believers. Thousands and millions more did not bother. Some were guilty of crucifying Christ. 8c, God will remove the church from the earth before the 70th week begins with the resumption of the 70 weeks program for Israel and Jerusalem. We have that study under the word. Go on to index R and scroll on down to rapture, and a number of studies cover that, especially 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18. D. The church is absent on earth in passages referring to the 7-year tribulation period, Daniel's 70th week. Just look at the characteristics of it and see what's going on with the church today, how that's characterized. Not doing well there either. The seventh inference for the pre-tribulation rapture of the church is gained from an examination of the references to the church in Israel in the book of the Revelation. We have references to the church in Revelation only occur before the 7-year tribulation period. 24 verses in the book of the Revelation refer to the church. 19 of these verses refer to the church as the church or churches. 2 verses refer to it as the bride. 2 verses indicate that the church is the Lamb's wife. And 1 verse refers to the church as both the bride and the wife of the Lamb. Revelation never refers to the church as the body. 20 of the 24 verses refer to the church, the present church age. Here they are. 2 verses refer to the church to the marriage of the Lamb, which will take place in heaven, not on earth. 2 verses refer to the church in the future eternal state. It is important to note that there are no references to the church on the earth in chapters 4 through 18, the chapters relating specifically to the 70th week of Daniel 9, including the seals and trumpets and bowls. There are references to Israel in the book of the Revelation,